I'll record.
I can, oh, I was going to say I could record it.
Okay, no, we've got it. Okay, we're officially starting. Welcome, everyone, to the November Planetarians Zoom Seminar. And again, we're going to, well, this November seminar, we have the privilege of having Chris Cannon, who is assistant professor with the Center for Cross-Cultural Studies at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And he's going to be speaking on the Northern Dene. If you're like me, I've heard of the Southern Dene, but I know nothing about the Northern Dene, so I'm really looking forward to this. As usual, stay muted. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, but for the most part, any live questions will wait till later, because your question may be answered sometime later in Chris's talk. And again, sign in the chat with your name and where you're from. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Chris. Welcome, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. I'll go ahead and set up the shared screen and we'll get going. Remember to share my sound because there's embedded audio files.
And I don't see the there you are. You're in presentation mode now, so you're good to go.
All right. Yeah, so just to get started here, I've been studying Northern Dene astronomical knowledge and practices since about 2008, and based here in Alaska. I guess I'll move to the next slide. I want to start with a lot of context because, really in the social sciences, context is everything. Beginning with a little background here, this is, an approximate map of the Northern Dene languages. And then on the right in the side window, you can see a smaller map of the Northern Dene or Athabaskan family more broadly. It's one of the most extensive language families in North America. The Northern group is composed of about 30 different languages. The Southern group or Southern Dene, also known as Apachean, includes, Navajo and Apache, and there's approximately 7 languages there. And then the other group is Pacific Coast Athabaskan, which is composed of about eight languages that are mostly now extinct, and those are in smaller regions in southern Washington, parts of Oregon, and Northern California. And so yeah, the focus of the talk today is on the Northern group across subarctic Alaska and Canada. In comparison, this slide shows the different communities where I visited to do work with tradition bearers of these knowledge systems. Again, this map reflects, 12 or 13 years of research in a very large-scale comparative study. You can see, the communities where I worked are most heavily concentrated in Alaska and also the Northwest Territories. The language family, of course, goes from, extends from central Western Alaska all the way over to Hudson Bay. So it's a huge region. When I started this work, I was actually an educator at the museum, and I was teaching, Western scientific astronomy using a portable planetarium. And I was on a NASA-funded space grant through the museum, and we flew to around 45 different communities, mostly rural indigenous communities off the road system. And during that work, of course, we were also interested in integrating indigenous knowledge into the planetarium shows. And, when I was giving planetarian presentations in these small communities, a lot of the students would have cultural responses to the content. If I played a video of the Northern Lights, for example, kids would often ask if the Northern Lights would chop off their heads, or, as a group, they just start whistling at the Northern Lights. And so there's a lot of cultural responses, and it made me feel as though I should learn more about this, just to better educate myself on the cultural knowledge of the sky. But so anyway, I turned to the literature and books, and I was trying to come up with information, and particularly for the Northern Dene, really kind of the more I looked, the less I found. And even in some of the more classic ethnographic studies, this quote here is very typical of the kind of knowledge that I was finding in the literature. And this relates to the Upper Tanana, which is an Alaska Dene language. And this is from Robert McKinnon, who states that the astronomical knowledge of the Upper Tanana is extremely slight. Star lore plays no part in their mythology, and only a few stars and constellations are identified by name. Small as the astronomical knowledge of the Upper Tanana is, it is apparently no smaller than that of other Northern Athabaskan groups. And so, it was, most of the literature is very dismissive that this is a big part of, Dene language and culture. Backing up a little bit, I want to talk about indigenous astronomical knowledge more broadly in terms of, what is known about it. Most of the research on indigenous astronomy has focused on, archaeological evidence, physical artifacts left by past cultures that no longer have, representatives who can talk about meaning or context or practices or any of those things. It's all reconstructed through the archaeological record. In comparison, there's approximately 7,000 world languages, or there were. Many of them are now extinct. And of those 7,000 languages, approximately 1,000 are considered to be well documented, which means they have grammars, dictionaries, texts, and audio recordings. In comparison, if you look at the sky and what we really know about the diverse ways that humans understand the sky and relate to it, less than 1% of the world's cultures have any sort of comprehensive documentation about their knowledge of the sky. If you look at the actual literature, I estimate that there's actually less than 50 book-length studies that approach indigenous astronomy in at least a somewhat comprehensive way. And that's, studies that are focused on working with indigenous bears who have living representatives of the cultures to actually, inform this type of information. And so the point here is really that what we know about how humans understand the sky is based on a sampling of less than 1% of the world's cultures. So there's really not much that's been documented. There's Polynesian, there's Inuit, there's Pawnee, there's Bororo, there's Australian. But even among these studies, many of them are topically based research papers that really don't look at a very comprehensive picture of the sky in total and how that relates to life and relationships. And so, the argument, though, is that humans have relationships to the sky. All humans do, that are no less a part of culture than other land-based knowledge and practices. This knowledge runs much deeper than what's consciously observed. It influences your circadian rhythms and many abstract concepts, such as a layered structuring of the universe, or heaven, for example. And so the earth and sky are not separate domains, so to speak. It's not this is our world and that's a different world. They're part and parcel to a society's cosmology and worldview, especially in indigenous cultures that have strong relationships and a very strong sense of relationality to all things. And so really it's the intersection of these domains where you really find these meaningful relationships between social processes in order and cosmological processes in order. And that intersection is really interesting to look at, how the order of the sky influences the order of societies and vice versa. A couple more slides on kind of the merit of this work. It's true, this knowledge is rapidly eroding all over the world. Language loss and language erosion is a big deal all over the world, particularly in indigenous languages. And so complex knowledge systems such as astronomical knowledge are really subject to loss, even though the language may be maintained every day. Replacement by modern technology like GPSs, advanced weather forecasting system, clocks, all of these things really undercut the maintenance of indigenous knowledge of the sky because the uses for the sky are largely supplanted by modern technology. It's much easier to look at your clock, than to go out and try to follow the motions of the stars throughout the evening or whatever. Increased indoor living, that diminishes the relationship to the sky. Light pollution, atmospheric pollution, globalization, all this, widespread sharing of ideas also undercuts the uniqueness of cultural concepts because, ideas are rapidly spreading all over the world and, cultures are always changing. And so globalization in many ways stimulates a lot of that gradual change. In the work that I've done, there are few culture bearers who maintain this knowledge. Among those, they know it very well, though, because they were brought up that way. It's reality. But a third of the elders who I worked with in my work have already passed away. And so this kind of work is generally time sensitive. I think we're approaching a generation. The next generation of elders may not have been raised in these ways of knowing. So the main question that I was asking throughout all this work is, how do Northern Dene peoples perceive, conceptualize, and integrate the sky and its contents into systems of knowledge, practices, worldview, cosmology, and spirituality? Like I mentioned, it's a 12 to 13-year study across 12 different Northern Dene languages, 33 communities, and about 75 elders who contributed to this work. The format for this presentation is, I think it's really important to start out explaining how I learned about this because, as I mentioned, context is really everything. And in this particular knowledge system, the process of learning is really what instills the principal Northern Dene constellation with its significance, its sacred significance and meaning. And so if I just jump into telling you what the Northern Dene sky is all about, it won't have the same impact as if I explain kind of how I went about learning this with elders. And so that's kind of the gradual build up towards the end, is that hopefully by the end we kind of come full circle and things make much more sense. But to get there, I want to go back to the early stages of the research when I was still looking in the literature. I ended up in this building here where the Alaska Native Language Archive is, which houses many unpublished documents and recordings on Alaska's 20 different indigenous languages. 11 of those are Northern Dene languages. And so after I really kind of failed to find much in published sources, I went to the archives looking for things. And this is a language archive. And so there are things like grammars and texts and word lists and all of these things. And so really what I did is I went through thousands of documents and I just started compiling names for things in the sky. Whenever that was found in a grammar or word list, I'd write down the name. And so I started to kind of look for patterns just from the terminology for things in the sky. And after doing that for, several years, the only thing that I could really find that seemed to be an important pattern was that the Northern Dene languages in the documentation only had this one word for the Big Dipper. It was the only attested constellation across the entire Northern Dene region, which is all of interior subarctic Alaska and subarctic Canada all the way over to Hudson Bay. And so it was curious, if you look at this word list, you can see there's two forms for this word that have been documented as Big Dipper. One is Hyati and cognates thereof, and that literally means one who sits in his house. And there's this other form like Nekeltani in Otna, and that's it's based on a verb for that which repeatedly moves or falls, and you can see that a similar form is also found in Navajo and Apache. And so there's these two forms for Big Dipper, but what didn't seem to line up was, what about all the other stars? Why don't they have names that are well attested across the languages? And so this is really this major question is really what led me to go work with communities, because this didn't seem to make sense. If you're traveling on the land and using the Big Dipper for wayfinding or something, those stars are relatively high in Alaska, and you're not going to be driving a dog team and looking straight up, because then you can't see where you're going. And so anyway, yeah, the major question is, what about the rest of the sky? The Big Dipper's only 7 stars. So anyway, I went to Fort Yukon and Arctic Village. They're both Gwich'in communities. I had previous experience working with those communities through a nonprofit, the Gwich'in Steering Committee. And I knew people there, and people referred me to go meet with some elders and see what we could figure out, because none of this knowledge had been documented, and nobody in the community seemed to know about this. And they, so many people said, this is, I've never even thought about this. You should go look into this with folks. And so I ended up, starting in the Gwich'in area, and it slowly expanded to other areas. But the part I really want to focus on is that, in the early stages of this work, I found that like an interview style approach was completely inadequate to learning about traditional knowledge in the sky. And so, questions, I learned stuff about telling time and forecasting the weather based on the stars and other aspects of the sky, but to really get into that deep relational knowledge, an interview style approach or asking questions just does not cut it, because you really have to ask questions about the nature of knowledge production itself. What counts as knowledge in an indigenous context versus maybe in a Western science, especially that would follow like more of an empirical approach. And so in many indigenous cultures, experience is what counts as true knowledge. And so if you experience something, that's your knowledge. That's what's significant. And so if you haven't experienced something, you can't just be told knowledge. You can't, receive oral instruction in that way, because it just doesn't really count if you didn't do it yourself. And so when you hear stories, there's always attributions of who told this story, because it's the attribution of, their experience or the person they heard it from. So anyway, when I did this kind of work, I do this kind of work, but when I started, I quickly learned that I had to be very flexible, and I learned to treat, field work as an experience in socialization, where you're not coming into a community, of course, as an expert or anything, but you're one who really knows nothing. You have to become socialized into a culture that's not yours. You have to learn how to knock on the door. You have to learn how to cut meat. You have to learn how to talk to people and observe silences, and you have to learn how to ask things. And culture is every aspect of your life that you share with a group of similar people. And so when you go into another culture that's not your own, you have to be socialized into those ways of knowing. And learning is also a very culturally constructed area. What counts as reality is different across cultures. And so you have to learn how what knowledge is, how it's valid. And once you learn that and become socialized into those ways of knowing, then you can begin to actually use that kind of epistemology and begin to actually learn. And so I had a slide back here called learning how to learn. I had to learn how to learn in a Dene way so that I could proceed to learn about the sky. Of course, with my primary Dene teachers. And so this slide is, from work with an elder in Fort Yukon, Paul Herbert. He's one of my very good friends, and he was the first person who I worked with on this, who really knew really detailed knowledge of the sky. And Paul was raised by his great-grandmother, Belle Herbert, who's pictured up in the right-hand corner. And she was born in the 1870s. And there's a book about her life called Shanda, which means in my lifetime. And in that book, she talks about how, it wasn't until she was a late teenager, 17 or 18, I think, before she even saw, anything from Western culture. And I think she mentions that ribbons in women's hair was the very first thing that she ever saw. And so from Western culture. And so Paul was raised by her at a remote community called Schumann House. And so he was raised in a very, very traditional Gwich'in worldview. And so even though he's still in his 70s, he has a very unique experience where he, learned this type of knowledge. I can only think of 4 or 5 other Gwich'in elders who know about this sky in a similar way, who are still with us. And so anyway, his knowledge about this sky is extremely good, even though it's an extremely endangered knowledge system. And so when I worked with Paul, I showed up at his house, and I ended up knocking on the door, and it was a little bit confrontational at first and not easy. But he eventually, he invited me in, and we got to talking, and I showed him that word list for the Big Dipper. And right off the bat, he said, "Oh no, Hyati, that's not just the Big Dipper, that's just a part of it." He said, "That's his tail." He said, "The Hyati covers the whole sky. It's a huge constellation that has many more different stars in it." And, why people have always documented this as Big Dipper is a major question. I think over time it's probably become reduced to that. But he said the Big Dipper is actually called Vitsi, which means his tail. And he said there's all other kinds of stars that are body parts that are part of Yati. But he said we're not going to just sit in here and talk about it. He said, if you want to learn about this knowledge, you're going to have to go out on the land and learn in that way where the knowledge really has meaning and context. And he said, if you stick with it for 4 or 5 years, you'll probably figure it out. So anyway, he said, you have to come back when it's dark. So I went back. That was in 2011 when I met him. And I didn't get back until 2013, but in that time I had enrolled in a master's program. And the director of the Alaska Native Language Archive, where I was doing all that research, said, you're doing all this work, you should get a master's degree and I'll chair your committee. And so the director of the archive became my chair, and we wrote an NSF grant together to specifically really to go work with Paul. And we received that. And so it wasn't until 2013 when I got back to Fort Yukon, with funding in hand to compensate for time. And there was 3 of us plus Paul at his house in late November in 2013. And, we're at his house in Fort Yukon waiting for it to get dark. And we're talking about the stars, and, it was going to be clear. And so we're really excited that we're finally going to get to see this. And so we couldn't figure out, we're trying for all those, couple of years, I was trying to think, what is Hyati? What is this? This is really interesting. I can't wait to go talk with Paul again. And so the stars came out, and we all pulled on our warm clothes. It was about 20, 25 below zero. And we went out on the banks of the Yukon River, and he started to rapidly name stars, just pointing to different stars and all different quadrants of the sky. And so I have a recording I'll play here because this is Paul talking about Hyati, and this is, the first time that, it's been recorded that somebody is showing somebody else what this is. And so, yeah, you can hear how cold it is because you can hear the snow squeaking and everything. But I'll play this just so you can hear what that was like when he was naming these stars.
You see 4 stars up there?
Yep.
Okay, that's the hand.
Okay.
And here's his tail over here. And over here you'll see 2 stars together.
I can't tell what is that what we call the Little
light.
Dipper?
There's too much light yet. Okay, and over here there's 2 more over here. And that's the back feet. And over here you'll see the Little Dipper. That's his nose.
And that's all part of Yahdi.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and he says Little Dipper, and that took me a while to figure out too, because in almost every Dene speaker I've worked with, Little Dipper means the Pleiades, not Ursa Major. Morning star usually means Arcturus, not Venus. And so even using English, it's really easy to get mixed up on what people are referring to using those words. And so it's important to actually be out there and actually see what folks are referring to. Through our work, these are all the different stars in Hyati, and you can see that there's Hyati plus 19 different star groups or asterisms. They're almost all named after body parts, and the Milky Way is his trail that links the earth and the sky or circles the world. He has a cane or a walking stick or a medicine staff called Vato. The Big Dipper, it's his tail, Vitsi, and then of course the body parts have left and right sides, like Ots Van Li is his left hand, whereas Straits Van Li is his right hand. And so all of these stars are based on body parts. And so if you look at this image here, it's pretty amazing. This circle represents the entire sky, and the constellation spans over 145 degrees. And so when you account for the height of trees, that covers the entire sky. And what's really cool about this system is that it's based on the metaphor of the human body, and the human body has bilateral symmetry. And so even if it's cloudy, if you see the 2 stars that comprise his left or right hand, you know where the other stars are, because you can infer their locations based on that bilateral symmetry of, this constellation arced over the world. The position of it is crouched on all 4s like an animal, as if protecting the world, but also arching over it. These 3 stars down by the foot are the morning stars. And so there are 3 morning stars, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But in any case, I just wanted to make it clear that this constellation is covering the whole sky, and the Milky Way is his trail. And so after we looked at the sky and the stars, of course, we came into his house and we're sitting around by the fire trying to warm up in his living room. And, we naturally asked, well, who is Hyati, right? He said, you know where it's at, that's enough. Like, he said, you're not really allowed to know who Hyati is. He said, if you figure it out and stick with it, you'll probably learn. But he said this, he said, there's one red star up there. I'm not telling you where, but there's a red star like that. Just certain people can see it. So it's kind of a sacred thing. If you don't believe in it, you don't see it. And if you believe in it, he said, it's up there, go out there and look for it. And if you see it, tell me. He said, I could show you, but you wouldn't learn that way. So you've got some work to do. And so what I didn't really understand at the time, that this was really kind of cementing the foundation that would make it possible for me to learn. In Indigenous contexts, when a story is told, or when you're shown something, it's really on you to make the meaning of that. And what you get out of that is really what you put into it. And so there's a lot of reflection that's intended to happen. Struggling through a problem on your own is really how you have deep learning, as opposed to having somebody just show you something and tell you what it's all about. And so, it took me 6 or 7 years to find this little star. But in the meantime, Paul said, you should come back and, you can stay with me. We really got to get out on the land, and, we should do hunting. And, that's the only way you're going to learn, is if you go do it. And so we started traveling on the land. We did two trips from Fort Yukon to Old Crow, Yukon and back, which is 600 miles round trip by boat. And so we did that twice. It goes through a very remote section of Alaska, and there's no communities there's old communities that are now abandoned, but there's no current communities in that whole stretch of river between Fort Yukon and Old Crow. But this is the section of river where Paul was raised. He still has, his family allotment there at Schumann House. But in any case, we were doing lots of hunting and things like that, even in the summer. And I was trying to figure out how am I learning about the stars, in the summer in Alaska. It doesn't get dark, right? So there's no stars. How am I learning about the sky? But we were hunting, and, I was learning place names and traveling and doing all these things that it is to subsist on the land, and get that relational understanding of, being with a very traditional Gwich'in elder, and really, it was an amazing gift that he would be willing to do all this heavy lifting to take me along and allow me to learn from him in in this kind of way. And so we did lots of traveling on the land, and there was a lot of questions that I had, but after a while of doing this together, I started to think, why did we go the places that we did? In particular, we were on the Porcupine River, and I started to realize that the ancient transformation story in Northern Dene languages, or in Gwich'in culture in particular, there's this transformer figure who went around the world, and his job was to make the world the way it is today. And so in ancient time, there was all these dangerous giant animals, and they're similar to the animals we have today, but they were giant versions of themselves, and they killed and ate people. And so the context, the subsistence context, was reversed, where humans were the prey to the animals. And so this figure set out around the world to transform everything and work with everything in the world to make it the way it is, to make the world safer for people. And in doing so, when he worked with each animal and transformed it, he was also embodying that knowledge of the animal, and also brokering protocols for how people relate to that animal. For example, if you kill a moose, there's certain things that you need to do after you kill the moose, and these protocols go back to ancient time, when this transformer brokered these different sets of rules to live by with everything in the world. And so the path of this traveler is really the first vision quest. He started out as an adolescent, and went on a dangerous journey to live with all of these dangerous things and transform the world into the way that it is. And so this transformer is really an archetype for the first medicine person who's embodying knowledge and power along his journey. And he does this until he's an old man. And all the stories that I've ever heard or have ever been published or read always end where he's lost, or he's still out there somewhere, or he disappeared. But that's intended to incite introspection about where did this figure go. And so looking at the images on this slide, you can see here's a rock. It's the place name refers to a woman who came out of the woods carrying a pack of caribou. And so you can see at the top of the rock, it looks like a person standing here with a hood on her head and a pack sack. You can see her legs. You can see her arm and a walking stick. And when you're up close, you can even see the fingers on her hand holding the stick. On the right, you can see this big swirled pattern in the rock. This place is near the Alaska-Canadian border. It's called Vedside Trick, and that means caribou room. And so this is the location where the transformer killed a giant caribou who ate people. And he slung the guts of the caribou against the rock. And so that's what you're looking at there is the striated pattern of the guts from the caribou. This caribou also had fangs in its mouth. And so the traveler who's called Chitehakoi, that's the one who paddled among things, removed these teeth. And so then there's a big gap in the jaw of a caribou called the diastema. And so that's where these fangs were removed. And so these stories from ancient time explain the way the world is. It explains relationships. It explains rules to live by. And at the same time, it's an epistemology. It's a system for knowledge production, and it's also, really the model for the first vision quest for others to emulate. In the lower right hand corner, there's a bluff. This is 12-mile bluff below Old Crow, where lots of Ice Age fossils are found. And this is said to be an ancient beaver dam created by giant beavers to flood the world. Chitehakoi broke this beaver dam with his walking stick to prevent the flooding of the world. And so anyway, through doing all these travels, I was able to kind of piece together the significance that we're probably spending a lot of time on the porcupine because this landscape is significant. And, after traveling the landscape and, knowing the stories and relating it to the places like that, the landscape really does seem to have, it evokes this feeling that you're being watched almost, and it feels powerful and almost like you don't want to say anything or you need to be careful. It feels like time's collapsed in a way where the ancient past is still alive and with you in the present. And so, the way that, traditional people relate to the landscape is very profound, but it's also very subtle, where it's not very overt. You have to really pay attention to kind of figure out, why people are doing what they're doing and that they're actually engaging in some sort of relationship. Sometimes it's very subtle, like just not looking at something when they walk by, or very briefly throwing a few bits of food, at a rock as you pass it in a boat or something. But like I said, these stories really explain the nature of the world in a Dene context. Each of these bones in the top of this slide are bones from a fish. And they're all different animal parts that relate to these stories. And so the bone on the left is the nose, like in the nose of a broad whitefish, and that's meant to be a moose foot. And the bone in the middle is like from the roof of the mouth of a burbot. And that's like a barn swallow, like a bird. And then over on the right is kind of, I think that's the gill raker section or the jaw of a suckerfish, and that's a pair of moose antlers. And so even when you're eating a fish, for example, like you're eating the food and you have these bones, each of these bones in the fish have stories that relate to ancient time. And so it's a constant thing. The tree sap, the bones in the fish, like how you harvest something, where you travel, how you relate to those places, like it's all related to this, these ancient stories and this massive epistemology. So getting back to the stars, that's the question, where did he go? Well, the stories end that he just disappeared. And like I said, that ending to the story is really intended to incite introspection and get people to think, where did he go? And it's on you to figure out. If you figure it out, you really come to know something important. And so that's kind of how I piece things together, that this traveler, Chitehakoi, when he died, when he finished his journey, he died, and his spirit went up to the stars and incarnated as this massive constellation called Shakti. And so one of the big questions is, what's with the name change? You know, Chitte Hakoi is the traveler, but the constellation is called Shakti. In Northern Dene context, you know, you generally avoid calling things that are very powerful by their given name. And oftentimes too, when a medicine person passes away, they're given a new name. And so Shakti is the one who sits in his house, and the universe is his house. That's his home. And the Milky Way trail connects the earth and sky. And that's his snowshoe trail that he, you know, took around the world. But also when others pass away, that's also the trail that leads their spirit back to Shakti. And so in many indigenous cultures, but in Northern Dene cultures, you know, reincarnation, which is called Netli, or to be again, is very prominent, or at least it was prominent at one time. And so when your spirit passes away, you go back to Shakti, and Shakti is the one who sends you back again as something else. And so the Milky Way trail is Vatai, which is his trail, but that's also the trail that your spirit takes back. And the little red star that I was asked to find is his heart. And you can see that in this image, that red section. And it's a very dim star, at least in Alaska, where we have lots of atmospheric ice. It's difficult to see 5th and 6th magnitude stars because of the suspended ice in the atmosphere. And so this star is like, it's in Lynxus. And in our atmospheric conditions in the winter, even when it's perfectly clear, it can be very difficult to see. To me, it doesn't look red, it looks white. But the significance is that the dimmest star in this constellation is the most significant star, and that's his spirit, or its heart. But the significance there is that it's the embodiment of the world. His spirit embodies all spirits. And so if you figure out what's in the stars and you find his spirit, what you're really doing is you're understanding your own place in the world, and you're understanding your connection to all things through time, and that you too are an ancient connected part of this world that has, you know, that goes back to the very beginning of time. And so speaking of relationality, you know, and reincarnation, you're related to all things. You know, it might be a piece of grass, maybe you're a dragonfly, maybe even a rock. But all of these things are relatives, right? And so maybe you were these things in the past. And when you go on your own vision quest, you know, for men during adolescence, and you're visited by something spiritual, it's not just being visited by anything, at least the way that I understand it and learned. It's that you're being flooded with the memories of your past life. And so maybe if it was a fox and you're visited by a fox, that's your memories of your life when you were a fox. And in doing so, you remember that knowledge of being a fox, and you remember how to act like a fox and smell like a fox and think like a fox. And if you're an old spirit, then you have lots of things, and that's power, because that knowledge is power that you can use. And it also, you know, again, reflects this relationality where the spirit is continuous through time, and it's only your physical body that's discontinuous. And so that's the significance of this, is that it's a massive relational model and epistemology for knowing and being Dene, and how to acquire knowledge and power, and how to relate to all things in the world. That's all in this constellation. Another significant part is that the morning stars are also part of it. And these stars are called Yedakahadjel. That means they went or rose far up. And again, this is not Venus. This is Arcturus and two other stars beside it. And above it, you can see the Big Dipper pointing down directly to these morning stars. So really about this time of year in Alaska, you can see these on the northeastern horizon. And they're regarded as spirits who followed all those protocols and lived life in a very pure way, so that they're not, when these spirits pass away, they're not anchored to earth. They just go straight up, right to Shakti, because they lived life like that. And in this work, I heard the metaphor many times, like keep your bag empty, or keep your pack sack light, or go with a light backpack. And that was told to kids when they were growing up, to live life in a way that you're free from material possessions, and you're free from that emotional baggage, so that when it's your time to die, your spirit goes straight up, like the morning stars. And so the morning stars, kids were always told to go out and look for these first thing in the morning. And so, when they were visible. And so it was that daily reminder how to live your life and how to relate to all things. They're also used in hunting context as a time referent. And so when this first star came up, you had to have, that's when you wake up in the morning. When the second star comes up, you should have finished eating and be in your warm clothes and get ready to go outside to go hunting. And by the time Arcturus comes up, the last star, you should be out on the land hunting. And if you're not, you've kind of essentially blown your chances for the day. But the other significance of this is that elders told me that, this early dawn period is when spirits go up. And so it's also very significant in terms of taking a life as a hunter, that this is a very important time for hunting and taking a life because of this strong connection. And so you can see that even though stars, have a function or a time referent, you can see how they're deeply embedded with spiritual concepts and worldview concepts and cosmological concepts. And so I'll play this audio recording, and this is Paul explaining how he grew up learning how to use the morning stars as a time referent for hunting.
Morning star. A lot of people go by morning star.
That's what I was going to ask you about next. There's 3 of them, right?
Yeah. See, say 4 o'clock. First one come up over the horizon. That's 4 o'clock. Next one is 5. And then 6. And then after that, there's daylight. You see? So when you're hunting, that's how people a long time ago, all they did was hunt. Go hunting for food.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, long time ago. They have to go hunting to survive. Okay, so they go by the stars for the direction, for their time. So early in the morning when you get up and you go outdoors, you go outside and you look, you see the stars start just peeking over the horizon, it's 4 o'clock. So then by the second one, you've already drank something, you ate, and you're on your way, because you got ready. Like if we're going to go tomorrow, we're ready to go tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we got everything ready. All you got to do is jump into your warm clothes and you're gone.
Mm-hmm.
By the second star. And by the third star, you're 1 hour out that way.
Yeah, so I'll kind of cruise through this last section, but really I just wanted to share how this compares across the languages, that it's something that's more it's shared more broadly than just the Gwich'in language. It's across essentially all the languages where I worked with elders. Charlie Hubbard was one of my very best teachers. He passed away, but he was also raised as a medicine person and began learning about the stars when he was 4. And he basically names the same constellation in his Atna language, and knows so much about it as well. Here's a short audio clip from Charlie just talking a little bit about Nicoltani.
Religion was taught one-on-one. It wasn't a whole congregation. It was taught one-on-one. And it went right along with nature, If you didn't respect your world, you didn't respect Nicoltani. And so that was the religion. And like you heard him talking there, you know, chicks at Wilchet, we want to be good people. You know, but they say, you know, we live by the earth, we live by the stars.
Yeah, Charlie was amazing. He was one of the few elders who, you know, I was extremely close with him, and he would talk to me and tell me things in a very, you know, overt way, and gave me a lot of the, you know, terminology and ways of thinking about spirituality in a Dene context, and how to talk about that, and, you know, also how to write about it and share it. So anyway, Nikeltani means that which moves over us. You can see in Atna, the constellations are approximately the same. I think in this version, there's also like the kidney is a uniquely named star. In some other languages, there's some very small stars above the heart, that's his hair. And so there's definitely some variation, but the overall context is exactly the same. And in Atna, the dawn light is his wife, like Ua Ukateyath is his wife following after him, and that's the dawn light. And so even the motions of the sky mimic Dene travel. And so, you know, in traditional times, the men would often when they're traveling, break the trail up on snowshoes and go really light ahead. And then the snow trail would harden up, and like the women would really carry the burden with kids and everyone else on the packed trail and come up after them. And so you're seeing this also depicted in the sky, that the way that Dene travel is also shown in the motions of the stars. And when the stars move, in Gwich'in they say Hyati aha, and that literally means he's walking. And so he travels all night long, is that circular rotation of the stars. These are the asterisms or star names in Atna. I'll just leave it here for a second because it's essentially the same as in the Gwich'in constellation. We're kind of approaching the end here, but this video is quiet, and so you might want to turn your volume up on your speakers to hear this video. But this is a really great video of Charlie speaking about, you know, the meaning of this constellation.
Nekaltan, he lanes with the earth, our land, our world. Nekaltan. He takes care of the land. And that's, you know, Nana so who needs Tazin is the way we should think. And who Dara still cheat. It's how we live.
Yeah, and so I'll kind of breeze through these. It's a comparative example from Great Bear Lake with a Satuot Dene. You know, there's a constellation called Hita. It's similar, but smaller. The really amazing thing about this is that almost all of the stars in this constellation are dim. They're not the big bright stars that comprise this constellation, aside from, you know, the Big Dipper. It's similar asterisms. You know, Great Bear Lake is in the Northwest Territories. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's a similar system. But to wrap up, I just want to note kind of the main points about this. You know, just in terms of summarizing this across the Northern Dene region in general, is that, you know, through the discovery of this traveler constellation, you really discover yourself and your relationship to the world as an ancient and continuous part of it, while also reaching this much fuller understanding of all that the traveler was, but also continues to be for humanity and the universe. You know, people say he's still up there, he's still watching over the world. And if you're one who figures this out and cements a relationship to it, you're really acquiring this world custodian as your primary ally, teacher, and helper. He's also a gamekeeper. So when you're hunting and living right, this is the one who sends you your animal. And so, yeah, this traveler figure, his transformation to the sky really completes this huge Dene epistemology for knowing, being, and relating to the universe and its inhabitants in all modes and transformations of life and spirit. It integrates into a more holistic cosmology, worldview, and spirituality than previously described in Northern Dene studies. As an ally, teacher, guardian, gamekeeper, and the embodiment of all things, who animates himself back to the world. He animates his power back to all things, giving it that animating life force. The traveler on earth and sky simultaneously links the past, present, and future, while also relating the individual, the society, and the universe. One thing I didn't really mention is that there's lots of prophecies based on reading the stars about what's going to happen in the future. And basically, like if the stars become stretched or skewed, or there's lots of different ways of reading into it, but essentially the world will be destroyed because that happens when people stop following the protocols and teachings of this traveler figure. And so really humans have the ability to prevent world destruction by living properly and following the correct way through life. And if not, then the system kind of disintegrates in a way. The stars become stretched and skewed, the universe is awry, and the world is destroyed and remade and goes through that same cycle all over again. And so, looking at the work that I did with elders, we essentially found variations of the same system in 10 of the 12 languages. 2 of these, Han and Upper Kuskokwim are extremely endangered languages with just a handful of speakers. And so we learned some about the stars that seemed to imply a similar system, but there just wasn't, there just wasn't the base to really to know anymore. And looking at Navajo is really interesting because the Navajo constellations are also subdivided. They of course have a completely different view of the sky in the American Southwest, but their constellations are all these figures that are named after body parts. And they also have this traveler figure in their oral traditions, in their brothers, which you also see in Northern Dene too, but their constellations in Navajo as well, which suggests that this knowledge system has really deep antiquity in the Dene family. And finally, when we devote time to creating experiences with Indigenous partners, we establish the context most conducive for advanced learning that may reveal and inform these deep systems of knowledge and ways of being and relating, such as those embodied in the Northern Dene sky. And the point of this is that my feeling is that there's probably many Indigenous astronomical knowledge systems that are very well maintained. And, I think they're probably overlooked because researchers don't approach this type of thing in the right way. Asking questions, as I showed earlier, is not conducive to learning. You have to learn through experience-based knowledge, and essentially living it. And of course, it's also deeply spiritual and sacred, and that's another reason why this kind of knowledge is not well known. That's probably a big part of why less than 1% of the world's cultures really have well-documented astronomical knowledge. Not that it's not maintained, it's just not public information. I should probably mention that, going through this, one of the big questions that I'm always asked is why were you allowed to write about this? And it's complicated, but essentially, working with Paul, my interpretation is that, if I learned about it in this way, then I would understand the significance of it and know how to talk about it and treat it. And also recognizing, that it is if it's not shared, it's imminently going to disappear. And so there was consensus on, that it's important to share this knowledge. And then when I learned in this way with Paul, it was really amazing because I went to work with other elders and I could come at it from a place of experience and say, this is who I learned from, this is what we did, this is where we traveled, this is all the hunting that we did and everything. And when I shared what I knew, then other elders were very open to saying, oh yeah, we have that too, and it's a little bit different. And so anyways, like I'd mentioned, like experiential knowledge is extremely important. And when you can come to something and share from a perspective of experiences, it's really important for the dynamic. And of course, I've spent many days with my teachers who did so much heavy lifting to take me through this. They're all close friends today. We stay in touch, we text, we email, we hang out, we continue doing work together. And so it's been really an amazing thing that's transformed my life and also, my worldview of what reality is and, what counts as truth and what counts as knowledge, and challenging our own assumptions about knowledge production. And so to kind of wrap it up, it's been an hour. This is a slide from different institutions and groups who provided funding for this research. And I guess we can open it up for questions now.
Wow, that is really great, Chris. Thank you so much. If people want to unmute, and we'll give a round of applause, actually would be appropriate. Thanks so much for this presentation. It's really great. And we'll see if we have any questions here.
So this is Rosemary, and it's so comprehensive from someone who's spent 12 or 13 years and has a very overarching academic view of it. But what do you think is the next step in terms of other people sharing it with the public?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Like I've often said to, anyone who I'm working with on this, is that, an academic interpretation or product is not the only product. Like we did the work, we have the recordings, and you can bridge these things into millions of different things. This has already been integrated into one of the Mali of Denali series, children's episodes produced by PBS. We documented information about moondogs, which was integrated into the most recent season of Mali of Denali. That's a children's television show has international distribution. We've produced a Gwich'in star chart as a community product with, it's a big poster. It's here in my office, and it's sold through the Alaska Native Language Center. It's essentially the same as what I had on those slides earlier, with all the star names on it. It's been people in the community, younger generations have picked it up, and there's been great response to this and feedback in terms of keeping it alive and sharing it, and it's been really rewarding to see young people have exposure to it. The difficult thing with sharing it is that to do it in kind of it's I guess to do it in the way that it's meant to be done is to go live it, right? And so, but who has 12 years to go on the land and learn in this way? And so it's important to emphasize that the knowledge is not lost. Like it's maintained in a very strong way. It's the context for learning about it that are most at risk of loss. And so we're kind of in this position that to maintain it, nobody's going to have the 12 years. The elders who know this might not be alive in 12 years. They might, but yeah, so sharing it becomes something that will have to require community involvement, like in a planetarium. How do you do that? Is it best just to have an elder record something that they feel is a good way to share it verbally with the image in a planetarium? These are questions that, you know, require funding and, you know, development in order to do it. It's one thing to be able to kind of answer questions in this format of sharing it and be able to like provide the context of experience, but when it's you know, it's out of the hands of somebody who learned it in that way, and you know, it's just being taught by an educator or something where there's not as strong a context for sharing it, it becomes more of a challenge. I think it can be done, but it's definitely something that would be require community input on how to do that.
Just a quick comment. Benjamin Mendelsohn pasted into the chat a link to where you can buy that poster that you were talking about. It's looks really
Yeah, great. It's right upstairs.
I have a follow-on question to Rosemary's question and your answer. Did Paul or any of the other elders who you learned with express, you know, in you know, considering what you're just saying, how, you know, to really understand this knowledge takes living with it? Did they express, you know, pieces of knowledge, or at least something that they felt could be more readily shared with kind of, you know, the world at large as opposed to the community? Because clearly it's important information for the community to have, but you know, what part of this cultural knowledge that did they want kind of the world at large to know about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you know, we've written things together. Like my dissertation is, you know, close to 600 pages, and you know, went through that and had Paul, you know, go through all the parts that he contributed to, and it was a major undertaking because it was going back with the people who I learned from after I'd written it and seeing, is this okay to share? And so in that context where they have control over saying, don't share this, this is wrong, then it's okay, you know, like, because they've said it, this is good, this is okay to share. So it's in that one particular context, and we've co-authored academic papers. You know, this summer we published one on using this constellation for wayfinding in the Yukon Flats, and that was partnered with Fred Sangris, who is Yellowknives Dene, and he's the current chief of DELO, and he uses a completely different system in the Barren Lands of Northwest Territories. And so we've co-authored academic papers together. The question that I don't know how to answer is, what happens when that's out of our control, you know, like how somebody else picks that up and adapts it and decides to teach from those materials. Like that's where it gets tricky, and you lose control over the situation. Like these things are published, and there's nothing stopping anyone from just adapting it into a planetarium show, because the knowledge is out there. But you know, it's yeah, it should have some level of oversight though, in terms of doing it through like a planetarium or an organization. And it's not that it can't be done, it's just that I would feel uncomfortable doing it without that input.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I've done work with Navajo groups and sharing their kind of stories, and yeah, it's that same kind of question, right? You know, when it's coming from the primary source, you can feel comfortable about that sharing, but then as it gets farther and farther out, the comfort level, for me at least, starts to drop. And I wonder, you know, is there some kind of protocol that can at least be you know, established for making sure that the connection with the primary source is always kind of there? A planetarium wants to do a show, who can they, you know, can they have, you know, an opportunity to learn a bit from the primary sources so that they can feel comfort in presenting those things in their settings?
Yeah, that's also tricky because, the primary sources don't want to just tell people things. Like they want you to go live it, right? And so it's not something that's really easy to just sit down and talk about. Because really this is such a powerful thing that you're not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to point at it. You're not even supposed to stare at it. And so we've, at the direction of those who I worked with and other community members and such, like we've had to stray from that because of the situation is that there's so few people who still know about this. In some languages you might find one, and maybe not. Like I mentioned, 1/3 of the elders who I worked with have already passed away. In some of those languages, I don't think there's anyone else already. And so, yeah, it's, yeah. They're questions that require input, from those who contributed. And there's it's such a spiritual thing that it's something that, people don't want to see just lost. It's really a matter of coming together and co-producing something that's meaningful. Co-producing knowledge, co-producing a planetarium show. It's all, I think that's all very possible. It's just that there's not really like readily available answers to some of the issues until you decide to get going with it and start asking how people feel and see what takes shape.
Chris, this is Chuck calling. How did this world view under the stars bridge those summer months when you could not see the stars?
Yeah, it's still there. Like the land is still there. You just, I really didn't learn much about, like, you can't see the stars. Is there any knowledge or stories about what happens in the summer? And it's not, it's just still there. It's just the sun is too bright to see it, but all those relationships with how you relate to anything on the land, it's all there. He's still watching over you. You just can't see him in the summer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think to Brian's point about are there things or guidelines or something that we can follow to be respectful of this knowledge? That would be nice to have a sort of concise. I mean, it's sort of I feel funny saying this, but a concise way of saying what are essential things that really should be included. Like what I got from your talk, which was amazing, actually. Thank you. Was the relationships and this is a very unique thing that the whole sky is this one, the traveler, and and what we know as the Big Dipper is just the tail, that kind of thing. But the whole idea of the relationships and that your whole life or your whole hunting and everything that you do is related to these things. If there's a guideline that if these certain things are included in any particular presentation, then it's maybe not perfect, but at least it's not straying too far.
Yeah, in our program here, we have the Indigenous Studies program for masters and PhD, but we do have guidelines on respecting cultural knowledge in general. But I think context is everything. Like if you have a planetarium show and you're not explaining the significance of what it takes to learn about it, or that relationship to all things, if you just show stars and say this is what this is without any of the background, then you're losing everything. And so that's really how you're culturally respectful, as you mentioned that this is how people treat this, and this is you really aren't supposed to point at it or talk about it, and this is the meaning on the land, and this is how it informs how to live life and relate to things. Like without that, then that's not culturally respectful. Like you have to have the context, because that context is everything in terms of the meaning behind this and how to relate to it.
That's a real challenge because, you know, you spent 12 years and in a planetarium program, you know, we're going to spend anywhere from 2 minutes to, you know, a really long planetarium program is like a half an hour these days.
Yeah, I think it could be simplified, but you definitely have to have enough context. Maybe it would have to be a standalone thing. UAF is slated to get its own planetarium up here on campus, joining the museum. I don't know how long down the road that is, but I've been a part of quite a few conversations to integrate this into planetarium shows, but none of them have really taken off with funding and gotten traction yet. But it would be amazing to see a full sky constellation in the planetarium.
That was another question I had. That image, you know, who created that image? And you know, based on what you're saying, I'd be reluctant to display it in the dome, but I really would love to display it in the dome.
Yeah, it would. Paul Herbert contributed. You know, we worked on that for a few years. The artist is the art curator at the University Museum here. And we just worked on it together to try to get it right. It's really making an image for the stars for this constellation is difficult because things become distorted because it's so huge. And when you look at the stars, like you form a mental picture in your mind, but that mental picture doesn't always correspond to accurate scalings of, say, the head or the hands. And so the head is this monstrous part of the constellation. And how you make that fit to the drawing to make the proportions look right is really challenging. And so it's a very loose fit to the actual stars. You know, you could do like a line drawing to see that the precise fit. But yeah, we had to stretch it a bit to make it work.
So another question is, I can see in sort of a program on the northern sky, where there's sort of a respectful survey of different cultures, that maybe there is a way to do this that focuses on the cultural and spiritual side, not so much on the specific stars, but it's also nice to see an example of a full sky constellation in comparison to what we normally see, which are individual ones. So, I mean, I guess I'm optimistic that there's a middle ground of something that's respectful and might be 5 or 10 minutes instead of like the full detail.
Yeah, I think it is too. It's just one of those things that if it just takes asking a few questions, right? And so it's difficult to do that unless there's a project in place that, you know, can fund that or stimulate those conversations. I've thought about it many times, and I know that it just takes sitting down with folks and asking them about this. You know, I have a really great friend who's an elder and who speaks the Upper Tanana language, and it's the same thing there. And, you know, she's also one of my great friends and amazing to work with. So it's just a matter of saying, you know, let's sit down and talk about this. Is there a way forward where you would want this to be shared? The impression that I get is that, you know, increasing the indigenous heritage and presence is powerful, and astronomical knowledge tends to, I don't know what the right word is, but it tends to generate a lot of respect for cultural groups, because I think the way that we treat, you know, astrophysicists in our culture, it's like, oh, wow, you know, versus being an anthropologist or something, it's not as exciting. So anyways, yeah, I think, you know, indigenous astronomical knowledge has a similar way of generating that kind of cultural respect for knowledge. I think it's probably just because the way that we treat that kind of profession in our own culture. But it does have a lot of potential to, bring focus to indigenous groups in Alaska and really increase that heritage. And it's a great way to integrate language too. Naming star names in some of the languages. It's great to expose people to indigenous languages through star names or place names or things like that.
Actually, a language is another barrier, like how to pronounce these things. And I was hearing Paul pronounce, I thought he was saying Shakta. And I think I heard you say Shakti. I think it was the same. I don't know if that was the same word, but I think it was.
Yahti. Yahti.
Yahti.
Yahti, yeah.
Yeah. Getting the pronunciation right is a challenge.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's a case for having an elder just recorded talking about something,
I do like the idea of including short videos of elders speaking within a planetarium program. Even within the sky cultures that are typically shown today in planetariums because they're available. It would be interesting to try to get some short recordings from elders from those cultures to start including, to have a better context for the way they're typically showed today.
Yeah.
Yeah, and since Ryan says he's in a place where he can't talk, I'll mention, in case you haven't noticed in the chat, he's pointed out that they've put together this One Sky project, which I hope maybe he'll come tell this group about at some point, which is a kind of along that idea, doing short videos from different cultures. And I think that can be an interesting way. I think someone kind of touched on this idea, and he mentions, for example, there's a few other cultures that have some examples of these all sky constellations, like the Thunderbird constellation, which is not visible even entirely in the sky at the same time, but it's actually a constellation that emerges over the course of a year.
Yeah,
I think it's super interesting to look at how the place that you're living in then changes your view of the sky, right? The fact that people at high latitudes would see a constellation, most of those stars are in the sky all the time when they can see them, right? So it kind of like, oh, well, that makes sense that they'd see that as an entire group, right? Because they're all always together in the sky.
Yeah, and in this constellation, I think the left hand is in Leo, and that's the one that dips below the horizon, like this time of year. So it's mostly circumpolar, but there's some stars in the left hand that dip below the horizon. So yeah, and that's the really neat thing about indigenous astronomies is they're very place specific. They don't translate across the region, so it really emphasizes connection to place. And it's really fun to learn about, because if you live in that place where that astronomy is uniquely adapted, everything seems to work out so well, and it's really neat to see that and experience it.
Can you shed some more light on the Northern Lights and kind of their interpretation of it? You mentioned that at the beginning.
Yeah, the Northern Lights, there's lots of knowledge about that, but essentially, everything is living, right? The Northern Lights are alive too, and they can be dangerous in one moment and helpful in another. There's some major themes like, whistling at the Northern Lights tends to make it come down. Kids are usually told not to do that because it can will come take them away. It's almost like messing with something powerful and interfering with it, like deliberately kind of jabbing it a little bit. Colors often are used for forecasting different types of weather, whether it's green or red. Red tends to be the northern lights are burning hot. And so it's really cold when you see red northern lights versus green northern lights. Quite a few Dene cultures talk about the relationship between caribou and northern lights, where when caribou are in a big herd, their furs rubbing together and it generates a lot of static electricity. And so that's really connected to the northern lights, that it's the similar thing above it. And so when you see a really bright display of northern lights, there'll be caribou underneath that. And the sounds of the northern lights, I think there's been recent papers in the atmospheric sciences about recording the sound of the northern lights, which was dismissed in Western science for until recently. But Dene elders always say you can hear it, and sometimes they say the sound of the northern lights sounds like that kind of wrestling sound of hair together, like a shh kind of sound, like a caribou herd, like running together, rubbing fur.
I heard a fireball in Northern California, and it did sound very much like that, what you're describing.
Yeah. And so then, like, dancing, the spirits of like dancing ancestors, there's really quite a lot about the northern lights. Some of it is very, very broad across the language family. Other aspects are very specific to different Dene groups. We wrote a chapter about it in my dissertation. It's available for download. You'll probably find it if you search for it.
And what was the title of your dissertation?
Northern Dene Astronomical and Sky-Related Knowledge, a comparative anthropological study.
Well, I think we're approaching we don't have an actual cutoff time, but we're approaching where we probably should start wrapping up. So think of any last questions that you might have. I personally think this was, well, I was going to say this was the best presentation we've ever had, but then I'd be accused of saying, well, I bet you'd tell all of the presenters that. We have had good presentations, but this is really one of the best. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And, the outreach part of it, I think, is really important. I think it's very possible just to have conversations with elders, but it takes a lead, right? It takes somebody to say, we'd like to work on this and put up money and organize something where it can be integrated into a planetarium show. And so, then you start to figure out who might want to partner on that. And but I think outreach is it's something that's well received. And I think you can have really positive exchanges when there's co-production of knowledge. I think a lot of excitement could be put into this, at a community level. It takes the lead and the leadership and the funding to get something going. And ideally, it would be something that could be adapted to, more than one planetarium.
Yeah, this sounds like it's ripe for a grant proposal. Probably not anything like an NSF proposal, but there may be funders who would jump at the chance to fund a planetarium experience based on this.
I think I put the link in for downloading the dissertation.
Oh, thank you, Rosemary. I'll be copying the chat and posting it with the archive recording of this as well.
Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Wonderful.
you very much.
Yeah,
Very
thank you so
powerful.
much.
Bye.